She was just his virgin maid, until one secret night turned her life upside down forever. Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. The grandfather clock in the Prescott Mansion's foyer chimed 11 times, its deep resonance echoing through marble halls that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadows. Savannah James adjusted the fresh white lilies in the crystal vase, her dark fingers moving with practiced grace despite the trembling that had started in her chest an hour ago. The storm outside was growing fierce, rattling the French windows that overlooked the manicured gardens of the Hamptons estate. She breathed in deeply, catching the familiar scent of lavender from the small sachet she kept tucked in her uniform pocket, a reminder of home, of her grandmother's garden in Georgia, of simpler times when love felt possible instead of forbidden. Tonight felt different. The annual charity gala had been cancelled due to the weather, sending home dozens of guests and staff members. The vast mansion, usually buzzing with activity, now held only silence and the distant sound of rain against glass. And somewhere in these halls, Julian Prescott remained. Savannah had worked for the Prescott family for 2 years, invisible as furniture to most guests, but keenly aware of every detail of their lives. She knew that Mr. Prescott took his coffee black with exactly 1 sugar cube, that he played piano at midnight when he thought no one was listening, and that sometimes she caught him staring at the framed photograph on his desk, the one of a woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile, the wife he'd lost 3 years ago in that terrible accident. But what the rest of the household didn't know was how Savannah's heart raced whenever Julian entered a room, how she'd memorized the way he moved with quiet authority, the subtle cologne that lingered after he passed, the rare moments when his grey eyes would meet hers and she'd glimpse something vulnerable beneath his carefully constructed composure. Tonight, as thunder rolled across the estate, Savannah finished arranging the last of the flowers and prepared to leave. The other staff had already departed, and she'd assumed Mr. Prescott was in his study as usual. But as she passed the grand piano in the main salon, she heard it, soft, melancholic notes drifting through the partially open door. She paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. The melody was beautiful and heartbreaking, played with the kind of raw emotion that spoke of loss and longing. Without thinking, she stepped closer, drawn by the music like a moth to flame. Through the gap in the door, she could see Julian seated at the piano, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. His jacket was draped over a nearby chair, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. His dark hair was mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it, and in the lamp's golden glow, she could see the exhaustion etched into his features. He was playing something she didn't recognize, improvised, perhaps, and the notes seemed to pour out of him like a confession. This was the man behind the CEO mask, the one who carried grief like a stone in his chest. Savannah must have made a sound, because suddenly the music stopped. Julian's head turned toward the door, and their eyes met across the shadowed room. "I'm sorry," she whispered, stepping back. "I was just leaving, and I heard, 'Don't apologize.'" His voice was rougher than usual, edged with something she'd never heard before. "You're welcome to listen." She hesitated in the doorway, torn between propriety and the magnetic pull of his presence. "The music is beautiful, sad, but beautiful." Julian's fingers found the keys again, playing a softer melody now. Music has a way of expressing what words cannot. He glanced at her again. "Come in, Savannah." "The storm's getting worse. You shouldn't be driving in this weather." Her name on his lips sent warmth spreading through her chest. He'd never called her by her first name before, always Miss James, in his formal, distant way. She took a tentative step into the room, then another, until she was standing near the piano. "I didn't know you played," she said softly. "Most people don't. It's not exactly part of the corporate image." There was a bitter edge to his smile. "My wife used to say that music was the only time I allowed myself to be truly honest." The mention of his late wife hung between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Savannah had seen the photographs throughout the house, a beautiful blonde woman with laughing eyes, someone who'd clearly been Julian's whole world. She must have been very special, Savannah said carefully. Julian's hands stilled on the keys. For a moment, she thought she'd overstepped, but then he spoke again. Victoria was everything I wasn't, light where I was shadow, spontaneous where I was controlled. She believed in magic, in signs from the universe. His voice cracked slightly. She died because of my arrogance, my need to control everything. Lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that made Savannah jump. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The generator should kick in soon, Julian said, his voice closer now in the blackness. But the seconds stretched into minutes, and the backup power didn't come. Savannah heard movement, the soft scrape of a chair, and then Julian's voice, impossibly near. There should be candles in the sideboard. Let me... His hand brushed hers in the darkness, and the contact sent electricity through her entire body. She heard his sharp intake of breath, felt him freeze beside her. Savannah. Her name was barely a whisper. Yes? Her voice came out breathless, vulnerable. Another flash of lightning revealed his face inches from hers, his grey eyes dark with something that made her pulse race. The rain hammered against the windows, and in that moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. I should take you home, he said, but he didn't move away. The roads are flooded, she whispered back. I heard it on the radio. They stood there in the darkness, the air between them charged with more electricity than the storm outside. Savannah could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. When lightning flashed again, she saw that he was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. There's wine, he said suddenly, his voice rough, in my study, and emergency candles. It wasn't really a suggestion. It was an invitation into dangerous territory, a crossing of lines that could never be uncrossed. Savannah knew she should refuse, should insist on waiting out the storm in the servants' quarters. But something in his voice, in the vulnerability she'd glimpsed, made her nod in the darkness. I'd like that, she heard herself say. Julian found her hand in the dark, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm, sure, and completely overwhelming. As he led her through the shadowed mansion toward his private study, Savannah felt as if she were walking toward her destiny, thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The storm raged on outside, but inside the mansion, something even more powerful was beginning to stir. Julian's study was a sanctuary of leather-bound books, mahogany furniture, and the lingering scent of his cologne. By the light of 3 emergency candles he'd placed on his desk, Savannah could see the room's intimate details, family photographs, awards that meant nothing to him anymore, and that single-framed picture of Victoria that he kept facing toward his chair. He poured wine into 2 crystal glasses, his movements precise, despite the tremor she noticed in his hands. The bottle was expensive, something that probably cost more than her monthly salary, but tonight, such distinctions felt meaningless. I've never had wine like this, Savannah admitted as he handed her a glass, their fingers brushing again in the transfer. It's just fermented grapes, Julian said with a slight smile, settling into the leather chair across from her. And Victoria used to say that the best wines were the ones shared with the right person, regardless of price. Savannah sipped the wine, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. The candlelight flickered across Julian's features, softening the harsh lines that business and grief had carved there. Without his usual armor of expensive suits and corporate authority, he looked younger, more vulnerable. You loved her very much, she said quietly. Julian's jaw tightened. Did I destroyed her? He took a larger sip of wine, his grey eyes distant. Victoria was an artist, a photographer. She wanted to document real life, raw beauty. I wanted her safe, protected. We fought about it constantly. Thunder rolled overhead, but softer now, as if the storm was moving away. Savannah waited, sensing that Julian was on the verge of sharing something he'd never spoken aloud. The night she died, we'd had another argument. She wanted to drive to the city to photograph some street art exhibition. I said it was too late, too dangerous, so she went anyway. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. If I hadn't tried to control her, hadn't pushed her to rebel against my protection, she'd still be alive. That's not how love works, Savannah said softly, surprised by her own boldness. You can't protect someone from living their life. Julian's eyes snapped to hers, sharp with pain. What would you know about it? He stopped himself, but the unfinished sentence hung between them like a blade. I'm what? The help? Savannah's voice remained gentle despite the sting. You're right. I'm just the girl who arranges your flowers and pretends not to notice when you play piano at midnight. But I know about loss, Mr. Prescott. I know about loving someone so much it terrifies you. The formality of his title in her mouth seemed to break something in him. He set down his wineglass and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Julian, he said quietly, when it's just us. Call me Julian. The permission felt intimate, dangerous. Savannah's heart raced as she repeated his name. Julian. He closed his eyes briefly, as if the sound of his name on her lips was painful. You don't understand what you do to me, Savannah. For 3 years, I've been dead inside, numb. It was safer that way. And now, when he opened his eyes, the raw emotion there took her breath away. Now I feel everything, and it terrifies me. Lightning flashed again, weaker now, and in its brief illumination, Savannah saw him fully. Not the distant CEO or the grief-stricken widower, but the man beneath it all. A man who was as lost as she was, as hungry for connection, despite the barriers they'd both built. I think about you, she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. When I'm arranging flowers in your office, when I hear you on the piano, when I see you looking so alone in a house full of people, I think about what it would be like to take away some of that sadness. Julian's breathing became ragged. Savannah, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. She stood, moving around the coffee table until she was standing in front of his chair. I know I'm probably crazy for feeling this way about someone I shouldn't even look at directly. I know there's a whole world between us that money and class and race have built. But I also know that when you look at me sometimes, I see something in your eyes that makes me believe in magic again. Julian stood too, bringing them face to face in the candlelit study. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, could count the lines that grief and responsibility had drawn around them. If I touch you, he said, his voice hoarse, there's no going back. I'm not good for you, Savannah. I'm broken in ways that can't be fixed. We're all broken, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. Her dark fingers looked beautiful against his pale skin. Maybe that's why we fit. The moment her palm touched his cheek, Julian's careful control shattered. His eyes fluttered closed, and he leaned into her touch like a man dying of thirst finding water. A sound escaped him, part moan, part sob, and suddenly his hands were in her hair, his forehead pressed against hers. God help me, he whispered. I can't fight this anymore. When his lips found hers, it was like coming home and falling apart simultaneously. The kiss was desperate, full of 3 years of loneliness and want and the terrible fear of feeling something real again. Savannah melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as he deepened the kiss, pouring all his suppressed emotion into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Julian's hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. Are you sure? He asked, his voice rough with want and worry. Because once this happens, I'm sure, Savannah said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. And I've never been more sure of anything. Outside, the storm began to fade, but inside the study, lit only by flickering candles, Julian and Savannah discovered something worth more than all of his family's wealth, the terrifying, beautiful risk of letting someone see your broken pieces and choosing to love them anyway. as Julian lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward the adjoining bedroom he never used. Savannah felt the last of her walls crumble. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. Dawn filtered through the heavy curtains of Julian's private bedroom, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. Savannah woke slowly, her body warm and languid, wrapped in Egyptian cotton sheets that probably cost more than her rent. For a moment, she forgot where she was, until she felt the solid warmth of Julian's body behind her, his arm draped protectively around her waist. Reality crashed back like a cold wave. She was in Julian Prescott's bed. She turned carefully to look at him, her heart clenching at the sight of his sleeping face. In sleep, the lines of grief and responsibility had smoothed away, leaving him looking younger, almost boyish. His dark hair was mussed, and there was a peace in his expression she'd never seen before. Last night had been a revelation. Julian had been tender, passionate, completely present in a way that made her feel like the only woman in the world. He'd worshipped her body with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, had whispered her name like a prayer as they moved together in the candlelight. It had been her first time, and he'd made it perfect, gentle when she needed gentleness, fierce when she needed fire. But now, in the harsh light of morning, doubt crept in like smoke under a door. What happened now? How did someone like her, someone who cleaned his house and arranged his flowers, navigate the morning after with one of the most powerful men in the Hamptons? Julian's eyes opened suddenly, as if sensing her internal turmoil. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them heavy with unspoken questions. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice rough with sleep. Good morning." Savannah pulled the sheet higher, suddenly self-conscious despite everything they'd shared. Julian seemed to sense her withdrawal. He propped himself up on one elbow, his grey eyes searching her face. "Are you all right? Was I too—" "No," she said quickly, reaching out to touch his chest. "You were perfect." It was perfect. Relief flooded his features, but it was quickly replaced by something more complex. Desire mixed with conflict, hope shadowed by fear. "Savannah, about last night." The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway cut him off. They both froze, listening to the distant sound of voices, footsteps on gravel. The rest of the household staff was returning. "I have to go," Savannah whispered, panic fluttering in her chest. Julian sat up, running a hand through his hair. "Wait, we need to talk about this." But there was no time. Savannah could hear Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, calling orders to the other staff members. In minutes, the mansion would be buzzing with activity again, and she couldn't be found in Julian's private quarters. She slipped from the bed, gathering her uniform with shaking hands. Julian watched her dress, his expression unreadable. "Savannah, I know," she said softly, not looking at him. "I know this was complicated." "That's not what I was going to say." She paused at the door, finally meeting his eyes. The vulnerability there made her chest ache. "What were you going to say?" "That I don't regret it, that you're—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "That I haven't felt alive in 3 years, and you brought me back." Tears pricked at Savannah's eyes, but before she could respond, Mrs. Henderson's voice echoed up the stairs. "I'll find you later," Julian promised. "We'll figure this out." Savannah nodded and slipped out the door, her heart hammering as she made her way through the mansion's back corridors to the servants' quarters. She managed to reach her small room without being seen, closing the door and leaning against it as she tried to catch her breath. The tiny mirror above her dresser reflected a woman she barely recognized. Her lips were swollen from Julian's kisses, her hair mussed, her dark eyes bright with a combination of joy and terror. She looked like someone who'd been thoroughly loved, and she had been. But as the day progressed and she returned to her normal duties, arranging flowers and cleaning rooms, the magical bubble of the night before began to feel like a dream. Julian appeared briefly at breakfast, impeccably dressed in his usual suit, every inch the powerful CEO. He greeted the household staff with his typical polite distance, his eyes only meeting Savannah's for a brief moment before he disappeared into his study for a series of business calls. The message was clear. Last night was an aberration, a storm-induced moment of weakness that would not be repeated. Savannah tried to tell herself she understood. She was being naive to think one night could change anything. But understanding didn't make the rejection hurt any less. Days passed in painful normalcy. Julian was cordial but distant, treating her exactly as he had before, as if she were invisible, as if her body hadn't been pressed against his in the darkness, as if he hadn't whispered her name like it was the most precious word in the world. 2 weeks after that night, Savannah realized her period was late. Another week passed, and the nausea started, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. She bought a pregnancy test from a pharmacy 3 towns over, somewhere no one would recognize her, and took it in the small bathroom of a gas station with hands that shook so badly she could barely read the result. Positive. She was carrying Julian Prescott's child. That evening, she waited until the house was quiet before approaching his study. Her hand trembled as she knocked on the door. "Come in." Julian looked up from his laptop, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to surprise when he saw her. "Savannah, is everything all right? I need to talk to you." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Julian closed the laptop, giving her his full attention. "Of course. Sit down." She remained standing, knowing she'd lose her courage if she got comfortable. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like a detonation. Julian's face went completely white, his grey eyes wide with shock. "Are you certain?" "I took 3 tests. They were all positive." Julian stood slowly, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. "I see," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. Savannah waited for more, for anger, for questions, for some acknowledgement of what this meant. But Julian remained silent, staring out at the darkening sky. "Julian," she whispered. When he turned back to her, his face was a mask of the cold composure she remembered from before their night together. "I'll arrange for a generous severance package. And of course, I'll provide financial support for the child." The businesslike tone hit her like a physical blow. "That's it. That's all you have to say. What did you expect?" His voice was sharp now, edged with something that might have been panic. "This was a mistake, Savannah. One night of weakness that should never have happened." Each word was a knife to her heart. "I see. I'll have my attorney draw up papers. You'll be well compensated." "Stop." Savannah's voice cut through his clinical planning. "Just stop." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the fear beneath the coldness. He wasn't rejecting her because he didn't care. He was rejecting her because he cared too much, and it terrified him. "I won't take your money," she said quietly, "and I won't stay here to watch you pretend that night meant nothing." "Savannah." "No." She backed toward the door. "I'll be gone by morning." She left Julian standing in his study, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and success, more alone than ever. And as she packed her few belongings that night, Savannah made a promise to herself and to the child growing inside her. They would build a life filled with love, even if it had to be a life without Julian Prescott in it. The brick building in Brooklyn that housed Savannah's apartment had seen better days, but she'd grown to love its honest imperfections, the way the afternoon light streamed through her small kitchen window, the sound of children playing in the courtyard below, the elderly Puerto Rican woman next door who always had café con leche brewing and advice to share. 3 years had passed since she'd left the Hamptons mansion with nothing but a suitcase and a fierce determination to build something beautiful from the ashes of her broken heart. Now, as she watched her son, Elijah, carefully arrange wooden blocks into an elaborate castle, she couldn't imagine her life any other way. "Mama, look!" Elijah called, his face bright with pride. "It's as tall as me." "It's magnificent, baby," Savannah said, setting down the lavender bouquet she'd been preparing for tomorrow's delivery. At 3 years old, Elijah was a perfect blend of his parents, her warm brown skin and bright smile, Julian's distinctive grey eyes and serious way of studying the world. He was clever and curious, with an attention to detail that reminded her painfully of his father. The resemblance was so strong that sometimes it took her breath away, but mostly, looking at Elijah filled her with joy and purpose. He was her miracle, her second chance at happiness. "Tomorrow is Saturday," Elijah announced, carefully placing another block on his tower. "We go to the flower place." "The shop," Savannah corrected gently. "And yes, if you want to come with Mama to work." She owned a small flower shop called Petals and Dreams in a trendy part of Brooklyn. It had taken every penny of her savings and a small business loan to open it, but it was hers. A place where she could create beauty and help people express love through flowers. The shop barely broke even most months, but it was enough. They had a roof over their heads, food on the table, and more importantly, they had each other. The evening ritual was always the same. After dinner, Savannah would put on her grandmother's old R&B records, Aretha Franklin, Diana Ross, Gladys Knight, and she and Elijah would dance around their small living room. He would giggle as she spun him around, his joy infectious and healing. "Sing the pretty song, Mama," Elijah requested as "At Last." By Etta, James filled the room. Savannah began to hum along, her voice soft and melodic. Music had always been her refuge, the way she processed emotions too complex for words. She'd written hundreds of unsent letters to Julian over the years, pouring out her heart on paper before burning them in the kitchen sink. But music she could share with her son, could use to fill their home with love. As she sang, Elijah curled up in her lap, his small body warm and trusting against hers. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile, the struggle, the loneliness, the constant worry about money and the future. In her son's laugh, in the scent of lavender that always lingered in her hair, in the small but meaningful life they'd built together, she'd found a different kind of happiness than she'd dreamed of in the Hamptons. But late at night, after Elijah was asleep, Savannah sometimes found herself at the window, looking out at the city lights and wondering, did Julian ever think about her, about the child he'd never met? Had he moved on completely, found someone else to fill the empty spaces she'd glimpsed in his soul? She'd kept track of him through business magazines and society pages, a masochistic habit she couldn't seem to break. She knew he'd thrown himself deeper into work, expanding the family business internationally. There were photos of him at charity galas and business functions, always alone, always wearing that same mask of controlled composure she remembered so well. Sometimes she caught herself imagining what would happen if their paths crossed again. Would he want to know Elijah? Would he see their son and feel the same overwhelming love that had consumed her from the moment she'd held that tiny, perfect baby in her arms? But those were dangerous thoughts, fantasies that could only lead to more heartbreak. Julian had made his choice 3 years ago. He'd chosen his grief, his guilt, his carefully controlled world over the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of love. On Saturday morning, Savannah and Elijah made their way to the flower shop through Brooklyn's bustling streets. Elijah loved these walks, pointing out interesting dogs, collecting pretty leaves, chattering about everything he saw with the unbridled enthusiasm of childhood. "Mama, why do flowers smell so good?" he asked as they unlocked the shop door. "Because they want to attract bees and butterflies," Savannah explained, lifting him up so he could flip the light switch. "They dress up pretty and smell sweet so others will notice them. Like when you put on your special perfume," Savannah laughed, kissing his cheek. "Exactly like that." The shop was small but carefully curated, filled with seasonal blooms and creative arrangements that had earned her a loyal customer base. She specialized in story flowers, arrangements that told a story or captured a specific emotion. Couples came to her for anniversary bouquets that reflected their journey together. Parents ordered birthday arrangements that celebrated their children's unique personalities. And increasingly, People sought her out for funeral flowers that honored the complexity of grief and love. As she prepared for the day's customers, filling buckets with fresh water and arranging displays, Elijah played quietly in the corner with his coloring books and toy cars. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny fairies, and Savannah felt the familiar contentment of a life lived simply but fully. She was creating a particularly complex arrangement, white roses intertwined with eucalyptus and baby's breath for a client's mother's funeral, when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up with her standard greeting ready, then felt the world stop. Julian Prescott stood in her doorway, looking exactly the same and utterly different, still impossibly handsome in his expensive suit, still carrying himself with that air of quiet authority. But there were new lines around his eyes, a weariness in his posture that spoke of years of careful isolation. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air in the small shop seemed to crackle with the weight of shared history, unspoken words, and the 3 years that had passed like a lifetime. Then Elijah looked up from his coloring book, and his distinctive grey eyes, Julian's eyes, met his father's for the first time. The color drained from Julian's face. His carefully controlled composure cracked, revealing raw shock, wonder, and something that looked like desperate longing. Hello, Savannah," he said quietly, his voice rougher than she remembered. "Julian." Her own voice came out as barely a whisper, and in that moment, with her son's curious gaze moving between them and the scent of funeral flowers heavy in the air, Savannah knew that the carefully constructed life she'd built was about to change forever. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, heavy with 3 years of unspoken words. Julian couldn't stop staring at the little boy in the corner, his son, unmistakably his son, who had returned to his coloring with the casual acceptance of childhood, unaware that his world was about to shift on its axis. "I came to order flowers," Julian said finally, his voice carefully controlled, despite the tremor Savannah could detect underneath. For my father's funeral. I'm sorry for your loss," Savannah replied automatically, her professional training kicking in even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Charles Prescott had been a formidable man, cold and calculating, but he'd been Julian's father nonetheless. "Thank you." Julian's eyes drifted back to Elijah, who was carefully coloring a picture of a dinosaur, his small tongue poking out in concentration. "He's beautiful." The simple statement hit Savannah like a physical blow. There was wonder in Julian's voice, and something that sounded like grief. "Mama, who's the man?" Elijah asked without looking up from his coloring book, his 3-year-old directness cutting through the tension. Savannah's throat constricted. She'd prepared for this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but reality was so much more complicated than her imagination. "This is Mr. Prescott, baby. He needs some special flowers." Elijah finally looked up, studying Julian with the frank curiosity of childhood. "You have sad eyes," he announced, "like the man in Mama's pictures." Julian's composure cracked further. "Pictures?" Savannah felt heat flood her cheeks. She kept one photograph of Julian hidden in her jewelry box, the one she'd clipped from a business magazine article. Sometimes, when Elijah asked about his father, she'd tried to explain in terms a child could understand, showing him the picture and telling him that his daddy was far away, but loved him very much. It had seemed kinder than the truth. "Elijah, why don't you go get the special crayons from the back room?" Savannah suggested gently. Her son nodded and disappeared through the curtained doorway, leaving his parents alone for the first time in 3 years. "He doesn't know," Julian said. And it wasn't a question. "He's 3 years old, Julian. How could I explain?" Savannah stopped, taking a shaky breath. "What do you want me to tell him? That his father didn't want him? That's not—" Julian ran a hand through his hair, the first crack in his perfect appearance. "I never said I didn't want him. You didn't have to say it. You made it very clear that Night was a mistake. That I was a mistake. You were never a mistake." The words came out fierce, raw. You were the most real thing that had happened to me in years, and it terrified me." Savannah felt tears threaten but pushed them back. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not here, not in front of her son. "Then why? Why did you let me leave thinking you wanted nothing to do with us?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant. "Because I killed my wife." The blunt statement hung between them like a blade. Savannah felt her anger deflate, replaced by the same compassion that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Julian, I loved Victoria with everything I had, and it destroyed her. She died trying to get away from my suffocating protection, my need to control every aspect of her life." His voice cracked. "How could I risk doing that to you? To him? So you chose to do nothing instead." "I chose to keep you safe." Elijah's voice drifted from the back room as he talked to himself while searching for crayons, his innocent chatter a stark contrast to the heavy conversation happening just feet away. Safe from what?" Savannah demanded, her voice low but intense. "From love, from having a father who would walk through fire for him. Do you have any idea what these 3 years have been like? Struggling to pay rent, working 16-hour days just to keep the shop afloat, explaining to a little boy why his daddy never visits." Julian's face was pale, stricken. "I had my attorney send checks. I sent them back, every single one." Savannah's eyes flashed. "I told you I wouldn't take your money, and I meant it." "Then how?" "I worked. I sacrificed. I built something from nothing because that's what people do when they love someone more than their own comfort." Her voice softened slightly. "He's smart, Julian. So smart it scares me sometimes. He builds things with blocks that look like architectural blueprints. He asks questions about everything. How flowers grow, why the sky is blue, why some people have more than others. And he's kind. He gives his lunch to kids at daycare who forget theirs. He hugs strangers who look sad." Julian's hands were clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. "He sounds perfect. He is perfect, and he deserves better than a father who's too afraid to love him." Elijah bounded back into the room, clutching a box of specialty crayons. "I found them, Mama, the ones that smell like flowers." Savannah knelt down to his level, her expression softening instantly. "That's wonderful, baby. Why don't you draw Mr. Prescott a picture? Something beautiful to remember his daddy by." Elijah nodded solemnly and settled back down with his coloring, completely absorbed in his task. The simple acceptance broke something inside Julian. Here was this perfect little boy, his son, offering comfort to a stranger because that's what his mother had taught him to do. "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" Savannah asked, forcing herself back into professional mode. Julian struggled to focus on the question, his attention constantly drawn to Elijah. "Something elegant but not ostentatious. My father wasn't a warm man, but he deserved dignity." Savannah nodded, making notes on her order form. "When is the service?" "Tuesday, at St. Matthew's in East Hampton." She quoted him a price that was fair but not cheap. Julian didn't even blink. The amount was probably what he spent on lunch, but for Savannah, it represented a significant commission that would help with next month's rent. "I can have them delivered Monday evening," she said. "I'd prefer to pick them up myself." Julian's eyes met hers. "If that's all right." The request surprised her, but she nodded. "Of course. Mama, look." Elijah held up his drawing, a surprisingly sophisticated picture of flowers surrounding a heart. "It's for the sad man's daddy." Julian knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Elijah's eye level. "That's beautiful. Thank you." "My mama makes the prettiest flowers in the whole world," Elijah said proudly. "She says flowers can talk when people can't find the right words." "Your mama is very wise." Julian's voice was thick with emotion. "What's your favorite flower?" "Sunflowers. They're like the sun, but growing in the dirt. Mama says they always turn their faces toward the light, even when it's cloudy." Julian glanced at Savannah, and she saw her own words reflected back to her, one of the many life lessons she'd tried to teach their son about hope and resilience. That's a good lesson," Julian said softly. "Do you have a little boy?" Elijah asked with typical 3-year-old curiosity. The question hit Julian like a physical blow. Savannah saw him struggle, saw the moment when he made a choice that could change everything. I hope to someday, he said carefully. Elijah nodded as if this made perfect sense. If you do, you should bring him here. Mama teaches kids about flowers. She taught me that roses smell like love and lavender smells like hugs. Julian stood slowly, his composure hanging by a thread. I should go. Thank you for the flowers. Julian. Savannah's voice stopped him at the door. When he turned back, she saw the raw longing in his eyes, the carefully controlled desperation. He naps at 2 on weekdays. If you wanted to come by when he's not here, to talk. It was an olive branch, fragile and tentative. Julian nodded once, sharply, then disappeared into the Brooklyn afternoon, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and the echo of possibilities. After he left, Savannah sank into her chair, her hands shaking. Elijah continued coloring, humming tunelessly to himself, blissfully unaware that his entire world had just tilted on its axis. Mama. The sad man smelled like Daddy Cologne, Elijah said absently, switching to a blue crayon. Savannah's heart stopped. What do you mean, baby? The cologne in your jewelry box, the bottle you never use but sometimes smell when you're sad. The bottle of Julian's cologne she'd bought months after leaving the Hamptons, a moment of weakness she'd regretted but couldn't bring herself to throw away. She'd thought Elijah had never noticed. He smelled like home, Elijah added, and returned to his coloring as if he hadn't just spoken the most profound truth of all. Julian sat in his car outside Savannah's flower shop for 47 minutes before finding the courage to go inside. It was Wednesday afternoon, and according to the schedule she'd mentioned, Elijah would be napping. The knowledge that his son, was sleeping just upstairs in the small apartment above the shop made his chest tight with longing and terror in equal measure. 3 days had passed since their first encounter, 3 days during which Julian had barely slept or eaten. His father's funeral had been a blur of business associates and social obligations, but all he could think about was a little boy with grey eyes and an easy smile, offering comfort to a stranger because that's what love looked like. The bell chimed as he entered, and Savannah looked up from where she was creating an elaborate wedding bouquet. She was wearing a simple sundress, the color of cream, her hair pulled back in a way that revealed the elegant line of her neck. She looked older than he remembered, more grounded, but no less beautiful. If anything, motherhood had given her a radiance that took his breath away. "You came," she said simply. "I wasn't sure you meant it." Savannah set down her flowers and really looked at him. Julian was impeccably dressed as always, but she could see the exhaustion in his face, the way his usually perfect appearance was slightly disheveled. His hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and there was a vulnerability in his posture that reminded her of that night 3 years ago. "How was the funeral?" she asked gently. "Appropriate. Father would have approved." Julian moved closer to the counter, his hands clasped behind his back. "I kept thinking about what Elijah said, about flowers talking when people can't find words. He's very intuitive. Sometimes I think he understands things better than adults do. He looks like you." "I know." Savannah's voice was soft. "Every day he looks more like you, the way he concentrates when he's building something, the way he asks questions like he's trying to solve the mysteries of the universe. Sometimes it's like having a tiny version of you in the room." Julian's composure cracked. "Does that hurt, seeing me in him?" "Sometimes," she admitted honestly, "but mostly it's a gift. He's the best parts of both of us." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 3 years and 1,000 unspoken words hanging between them. Julian moved to examine the wedding bouquet she'd been working on, white peonies and garden roses with trailing ivy and baby's breath. "It's beautiful," he said. "You always had an eye for beauty. It's for a couple who've been together for 50 years. They're renewing their vows." Savannah touched one of the roses gently. "She told me they eloped when they were 19 because her parents didn't approve. They've had 6 children, 14 grandchildren, and more struggles than most people face in a lifetime. But they chose to keep choosing each other. The story hung between them like a challenge, a reminder of what commitment really meant. "I bought him a toy," Julian said suddenly, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "I don't know what 3-year-olds like, but the woman at the store said it was appropriate for his age." Savannah took the package, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. "Julian, I know I have no right. I know I gave up any claim to him when I let you walk away, but I can't stop thinking about him, about you." His voice cracked. "For 3 years, I've told myself I was protecting you from my damage, but maybe I was just protecting myself from having to risk loving someone again. And now," Julian met her eyes, and she saw something in them she'd never seen before. Hope, fragile and terrifying. "Now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe love isn't about control or protection. Maybe it's about showing up, even when you're scared." Upstairs, they could hear the soft sound of Elijah stirring from his nap, talking to his stuffed animals in the sleepy, rambling way of children. The sound made Julian freeze, his expression shifting to something like panic. "I should go," he said quickly. "Julian, wait." Savannah moved around the counter, closing the distance between them. "He's going to wake up soon, and he's going to come downstairs. You can meet him properly if you want." "I don't know how to be a father," Julian whispered. "I never had a good example. My father was cold, distant. What if I damage him the way—" "Stop." Savannah reached up and cupped his face in her hands, the same gesture that had broken his control 3 years ago. "You are not your father. The man who played piano in the storm, who made love to me like I was precious, who just spent 3 days thinking about a little boy he barely knows. That man would be an amazing father." "Mama?" Elijah's sleepy voice drifted down from upstairs. "I'm awake." Julian's eyes were wide with terror and longing. "What do I say to him?" "You start with hello," Savannah said softly. "Everything else will follow." Elijah appeared at the top of the narrow staircase that led to their apartment, rubbing his eyes and clutching a well-loved stuffed elephant. When he saw Julian, he smiled with the easy acceptance of childhood. "Hi, sad man. Did you come back for more flowers?" Julian knelt down as Elijah descended the stairs, bringing himself to the little boy's level. "I came to bring you something," he said, his voice remarkably steady. "And to thank you for the beautiful picture you drew for my father." "You're welcome," Elijah said solemnly. "Mama says when people are sad, we should be extra kind. Your mama is very smart." Julian held out the wrapped package. "This is for you." Elijah looked to Savannah for permission, and when she nodded, he carefully unwrapped the gift. Inside was a set of wooden building blocks, but not ordinary ones. These were precisely crafted, architectural in their design, with curves and angles that would challenge even an adult. "Wow," Elijah breathed, his eyes lighting up. "These are like grown-up blocks." "I thought you might like to build something special with them," Julian said, watching his son's reaction with wonder. "Can you help me?" Elijah asked, then added with characteristic 3-year-old logic, "Since you're here and you look lonely." Julian glanced at Savannah, who nodded encouragement. "I'd like that very much." For the next hour, Julian sat on the floor of the flower shop, helping his son build an elaborate castle while Savannah worked on arrangements nearby. She watched them together, Julian's careful patience as he showed Elijah how to balance the more complex pieces. Elijah's delighted chatter as he explained his architectural vision. The way Julian's face softened every time their son smiled at him. It was a glimpse of what could have been, what still might be if they were brave enough to try. "This is the tower where the princess lives," Elijah explained, carefully placing a cylindrical block. "And this is where the prince comes to visit her, but not to save her because she can save herself." Julian's eyes met Savannah's across the room, and she saw him fall in love with their son in real time. The wonder, the fierce protectiveness, the overwhelming gratitude for this perfect little person they'd created together. "That's a very good story," Julian said softly. "These strong princesses are the best kind." When it came time for Julian to leave, Elijah hugged him goodbye with the easy affection of childhood, unaware that the simple gesture had completely undone his father. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Elijah asked. Julian looked to Savannah, the question clear in his eyes. "If your mama says it's okay." "Can he, Mama? Please?" Savannah felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "Now we'll see, baby." After Julian left, Elijah chatted excitedly about the nice man and his wonderful blocks while they prepared dinner. But later, as she tucked him into bed, he grew thoughtful. "Mama, why don't I have a daddy like the other kids?" The question she'd been dreading, asked with innocent curiosity that broke her heart. "Some families are different, sweetheart. Some have mommies and daddies, some have just mommies or just daddies, some have grandparents or aunts and uncles. What matters is that you're loved." Elijah considered this seriously. "The nice man has sad eyes like you do sometimes. Maybe he needs a family too." Out of the mouths of babes, Savannah kissed her son's forehead, breathing in his sweet, sleepy scent. "Maybe he does, baby. Maybe he does." That night, as she lay in bed listening to the city sounds outside her window, Savannah allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to try again, to risk her heart, her carefully built life, on the possibility that Julian had truly changed, that fear hadn't permanently damaged his capacity to love. It was a dangerous dream, but for the first time in 3 years, it felt like it might be worth the risk. 2 weeks established a rhythm that felt both natural and terrifying. Julian came to the flower shop every few days, always during Elijah's nap time, ostensibly to discuss the logistics of being in his son's life, but really just to be near them both. He and Savannah talked carefully around the deeper issues: custody, support, the future, while slowly rediscovering each other as people rather than memories. Julian had changed in subtle ways that surprised her. He was more patient, more present. When he played with Elijah, he gave the little boy his complete attention, as if 3-year-old architectural theories were the most important business in the world. He never checked his phone during visits, never seemed rushed or distracted by the corporate empire that had once consumed his life. "I've been thinking," Julian said one Thursday afternoon, as they watched Elijah carefully construct a bridge between 2 chairs. They were sitting on the floor of the shop, surrounded by building blocks and the comfortable chaos of childhood play. "About what?" Savannah asked, though her pulse quickened. These conversations that started with, "I've been thinking," usually led to territory that made her heart race. "About what this looks like, long term." Julian's voice was careful, measured. "I want to be part of his life, Savannah. Really part of it, not just the man who visits sometimes." "What does that mean exactly?" Julian was quiet for a moment, watching Elijah test the structural integrity of his bridge with a toy car. "I want him to know I'm his father. I want to take him to the park on weekends, help with bedtime stories, be there when he's sick or scared or excited about something. I want him to never doubt that he's loved, that he's wanted." Julian's voice dropped. "I want to be the father I never had." The simple honesty of it brought tears to Savannah's eyes. "Julian, I know I have no right to ask for that. I know I walked away when you needed me most. But if you'll let me, I want to try to earn it." Before Savannah could respond, Elijah's bridge collapsed in a dramatic crash of wooden blocks. Instead of crying or getting frustrated, he clapped his hands in delight. "Just did you see that, Mama? It made the best sound ever." Julian laughed, a real, genuine laugh that transformed his entire face. "Maybe we should build something that's supposed to fall down next time." "Yes!" Elijah bounced excitedly. "Like dominoes, but with blocks." Watching them together, Savannah felt her resistance weakening. This was what she'd dreamed of during those long, lonely nights. Not the money or the security Julian could provide, but this easy partnership, this joy he brought to their son's face. "There's something you should know," she said quietly, while Elijah gathered blocks for his next project. "I told him his father was far away, but that he loved him very much. He started asking more questions lately." Julian's hands stilled in the process of sorting blocks by size. What kind of questions? Why his daddy can't visit, whether his daddy thinks about him, if his daddy would be proud of the things he builds. Savannah's voice softened. I've been running out of answers that don't involve lies. What do you want to tell him? It was the question she'd been avoiding, but sitting here in the golden afternoon light with Julian looking at her like her answer was the most important thing in the world, she found her courage. The truth. That his daddy was scared of love because someone he loved very much got hurt, that he needed time to learn how to be brave, and that now he's here because he realized love is worth the risk. Julian's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. Is it worth the risk? I don't know, Savannah admitted. But I know our son deserves the chance to find out. That evening, after Julian had reluctantly left for another business obligation, Savannah made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She was going to tell Elijah the truth about his father. She waited until after dinner, when they were settled on the couch for their evening story time. Instead of reaching for one of his usual books, she pulled him into her lap and took a deep breath. Baby, remember how you've been asking about your daddy? Elijah nodded solemnly, his grey eyes, so like Julian's, focused intently on her face. Well, your daddy is someone very special, someone who was scared for a long time because his heart was hurt, but who loves you and me very much. Is he far away? Not anymore. Savannah's voice caught slightly. Actually, you've met him, the nice man who's been visiting us, Julian. He's your daddy. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the serious consideration he brought to all important matters. Julian is my daddy. Yes, sweetheart. But why didn't he tell me? It was exactly the question she'd feared, and exactly the one she owed him an honest answer to. Because grown-ups sometimes make things more complicated than they need to be. He wanted to make sure you liked him before he told you who he really was. I do like him, Elijah said matter-of-factly. He builds good towers, and he listens when I talk about important things. Those are very good qualities in a daddy, Savannah agreed, smiling through her tears. Can I tell him I know? Tomorrow. We'll see, baby. Maybe we should wait a little bit, make sure he's ready. But Elijah was already planning. I'm going to build him the best castle ever, with a tower for sad daddies who are learning to be happy. The next afternoon, Julian arrived to find Elijah waiting for him with barely contained excitement and an elaborate block construction. Julian, look what I made for you! Elijah bounced on his toes as he revealed his masterpiece, a castle with multiple towers, each one carefully balanced and precisely placed. It's incredible, Julian said, kneeling down to examine the structure more closely. Tell me about it. This tower is for daddies who are learning to love, Elijah announced proudly. And this one is for mamas who are brave. And this big one in the middle is for little boys who get to have both. Julian's eyes shot to Savannah's, wide with shock and something that looked like panic. She nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming what he'd already guessed. Elijah knows, she said softly. Mama told me you're my daddy, Elijah said, climbing into Julian's lap with the easy trust of childhood. I'm glad it's you. You smell nice, and you're not scared of my big buildings. Julian's arms came around his son automatically, holding him close as if he might disappear. I'm glad it's me, too, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Can I call you Daddy now instead of Julian, if you want to? I want to. Elijah settled more comfortably against Julian's chest. Daddy, will you help me add a garage to my castle, for the cars that visit the princesses? I would love to help you with that. Savannah watched father and son begin planning architectural additions to the castle and felt something shift permanently in her chest. This was right. Whatever complications lay ahead, whatever obstacles they'd have to navigate, this moment was absolutely right. Later, as Elijah napped and she and Julian talked quietly in the shop, she found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. What happens now? Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the afternoon light. Now I ask if you'll let me try to earn my way back into your life the same way I'm earning my way into his. Not because of obligation or guilt, but because I love you. Because I never stopped loving you, and I'm tired of being afraid of what that means. Julian, I know I don't deserve it. I know I hurt you in ways that might never fully heal. But if you'll give me the chance, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that love doesn't have to be terrifying. That it can be the safest, most beautiful thing in the world. Savannah looked into his grey eyes and saw the man she'd fallen in love with 3 years ago, not the controlled CEO or the grief-stricken widower, but the vulnerable, passionate soul who'd played piano in the storm and made love to her like she was his salvation. "One step at a time," she said finally. "We have Elijah to think about now. He comes first, always." "Always," Julian agreed. "But maybe we can take those steps together." It wasn't a declaration of forever. It wasn't a promise that everything would be perfect. But it was a beginning, fragile and precious and worth fighting for. 6 months of careful courtship followed. A slow dance of trust and discovery that felt both like coming home and venturing into uncharted territory. Julian approached loving them the same way Elijah approached his building projects, with infinite patience, careful attention to foundation, and the understanding that the most beautiful structures took time to create. He started small. Saturday morning breakfasts became a tradition, with Julian arriving at the apartment above the flower shop with pastries from an upscale bakery and stories from his week that made Elijah giggle. He learned to read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, to braid Savannah's hair when her hands were busy with flowers, to navigate the unique chaos of loving a precocious 4-year-old who had opinions about everything. "Daddy, why do rich people have such big houses if they're just going to be lonely in them?" Elijah asked one afternoon as they walked through Central Park. It was one of their weekend adventures. Julian had started planning elaborate outings that were really just excuses to spend time together as a family. Julian paused in pushing the swing, considering the question seriously. "I think sometimes people build big houses because they're trying to fill an empty feeling inside, but houses can't do that. Only love can." "Is that why you lived in a big house? Because you were empty?" "Yes," Julian said simply. Before I met your mama, and before I knew about you, I was very empty." Elijah nodded solemnly, then brightened. "But now you're full of love, so you don't need the big house anymore." "That's exactly right." Savannah watched this exchange from a nearby bench, her heart full of wonder at how naturally Julian had taken to fatherhood. He never talked down to Elijah, never dismissed his questions as childish. Instead, he engaged with their son's curiosity as if 4-year-old philosophy was the most important conversation in the world. The changes in Julian went deeper than just learning to be a father. He'd stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Prescott Industries, promoting trusted executives and restructuring his role to allow for what he called a more balanced life. The man who had once worked 16-hour days now made sure to be done by 6 so he could help with dinner and bedtime routines. "I've been thinking about something," Julian said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. Elijah was in the living room, building an elaborate city with his blocks and narrating the adventures of its tiny inhabitants. "That sounds dangerous," Savannah teased, but her smile faded when she saw how serious he looked. "I want to buy a house. Not a mansion, not something ostentatious, just a home, with a yard where Elijah can play, and space for your flowers, and maybe a piano." Savannah's hands stilled in the soapy dishwater. "Julian, I know it's a big step. I know we're still figuring this out, but I hate leaving you both every night. I hate that Elijah has to whisper after 8 o'clock because the neighbors downstairs work early shifts. I want us to have space to just be a family." The word family hung between them, heavy with possibility and terror in equal measure. They'd been dancing around it for months, this idea that they might be building something permanent together. "Where were you thinking?" she asked carefully. "There's a house in Park Slope. Victorian, but not too big. It has a garden where you could grow the lavender you love, and the seller is motivated because they're relocating for work." Julian's words came out in a rush, as if he'd been rehearsing this conversation. "I made an offer, but it's contingent on your approval. I won't do anything you're not comfortable with. You made an offer already. I've been driving by it for weeks, imagining you in the garden, imagining Elijah climbing the apple tree in the backyard, but only if you want it too." Savannah dried her hands slowly, buying time to process. A house, a real home, not just the small apartment that had been their refuge, but an actual place to build a life. It represented everything she'd dreamed of, and everything that terrified her about depending on Julian again. "Can we see it?" she asked finally. The house was perfect, and that was the problem. It was exactly what she would have chosen herself. Charming without being ostentatious, spacious without being overwhelming. The kitchen had windows that looked out onto the garden, and there was a cozy reading nook that would be perfect for bedtime stories. Upstairs, the master bedroom had French doors that opened onto a small balcony, and down the hall was a child's room that Elijah immediately claimed as his own. "Mama, look, this window is just the right height for seeing the whole world." Elijah pressed his nose against the glass, fogging it with his excited breath. "What do you think?" Julian asked quietly as they stood in the empty living room, watching their son explore his potential new space. "And I think it's beautiful," Savannah said honestly, "and I think you know exactly what you're doing." "What do you mean?" "You're making it impossible for me to say no. You find the perfect house, at the perfect price, with the perfect yard for our son to play in. How could I object to that?" Julian's face fell. "That wasn't my intention. I just wanted—" "I know what you wanted." Savannah turned to face him fully. "And I wanted too. That's what scares me." "Why does it scare you?" "Because I'm still that girl who fell in love with her boss and ended up pregnant and alone. I'm still afraid that if I let myself depend on you, if I let Elijah get too attached, you might decide this life is too complicated and walk away again." Julian was quiet for a long moment, watching Elijah measure the dimensions of his potential room with careful 4-year-old steps. "Do you remember what you told me that night in the study about being broken?" Savannah nodded. "You said, maybe that's why we fit. I didn't understand what you meant then, but I do now." Julian moved closer, his voice soft. "I'm not the same man who let you walk away. I'm not the same man who was so afraid of losing someone that I pushed away the best thing that ever happened to me. But I'm still broken in some ways. I still have days when the fear creeps in, when I wonder if I'm capable of being the man you and Elijah deserve. And then I remember that you chose to trust me with our son's heart, that Elijah calls me daddy like it's the most natural thing in the world, that you let me close enough to fall in love with you all over again." Julian's hands found hers. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I can't promise I won't sometimes let fear make my decisions. But I can promise that I'll never stop fighting for this, for us, for the family we're building together. Mama, Daddy, come see the best part." Elijah's voice called from upstairs. They found him in what would be his bedroom, standing next to the window that looked out over the garden. "Look, you can see the flowers from here, and there's a tree that's perfect for climbing, and space for all my blocks, and—" He paused, studying their faces. "Are you going to say yes? To the house, I mean?" Savannah looked at her son's hopeful face, then at Julian's careful expression that didn't quite hide his own hope, then out at the garden where she could already envision lavender growing alongside roses and the herbs she'd always wanted to cultivate. "Yes," she said, and felt something settle into place in her chest. "Yes, we're going to say yes." Elijah whooped with joy, launching himself into Julian's arms, and as Julian spun their son around the empty room, Savannah felt the last of her walls come down. This was what love looked like when you were brave enough to build it together, not perfect, not without risk, but real and solid and worth everything. That night, as they celebrated with pizza in their soon-to-be former apartment, Elijah fell asleep between them on the couch, exhausted from excitement. Julian carefully carried him to bed, while Savannah cleaned up the remnants of their impromptu party. "He's happy," Julian said when he returned, settling beside her on the couch. "He is. He's always been happy, but this is different. This is the happiness that comes from feeling completely secure. And you? Are you happy?" Savannah considered the question. Happy felt too small a word for what she was feeling. This combination of joy and gratitude and the deep, bone-level certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "I'm home," she said finally. "For the first time in my life, I'm really home." Julian's arms came around her, and as she settled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Savannah allowed herself to believe in forever. The house in Park Slope became their sanctuary, a place where love grew alongside Savannah's carefully tended garden and Elijah's increasingly ambitious architectural projects. For 8 months, they lived in a bubble of domestic happiness that felt almost too perfect to last. Savannah should have known the universe would test them eventually. The test came on a rainy Thursday in October, delivered by Julian's lawyer in the form of a custody petition. "I don't understand," Savannah said, staring at the legal documents spread across their kitchen table while Elijah played upstairs, blissfully unaware that his world was being threatened. "Who filed this?" Julian's face was pale, his jaw tight with barely controlled rage. "Victoria's parents. They're claiming that I'm an unfit father, that Elijah should be in their custody, but they have no legal standing. They're arguing that Victoria was essentially Elijah's stepmother during the time we were together, and that as my deceased wife's parents, they have rights to my children." Julian's voice was bitter. "It's complete nonsense legally, but it's designed to create chaos and pain." Savannah felt ice forming in her stomach. "Why would they do this?" "Because they blame me for Victoria's death, and this is their way of punishing me. They want to hurt me in the most devastating way possible, by taking away the family I've found." The documents detailed a character assassination that was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Victoria's parents had hired investigators who had uncovered every detail of Julian and Savannah's relationship, twisting their love story into something sordid and inappropriate. They painted Julian as an unstable man who had taken advantage of an employee, abandoned his pregnant mistress, and was now playing house with people beneath his social station. "They're calling me a gold digger," Savannah said quietly, her voice hollow. "They're saying I seduced you for money and that Elijah is growing up in an environment of moral corruption." "None of this matters," Julian said fiercely. "It's just noise. My lawyer says there's no way they can win, but the process itself will destroy us." Savannah's hands were shaking as she set down the papers. "Do you know what this kind of legal battle means? Months of depositions, character witnesses, every detail of our private life dissected in court. Elijah's friends, parents reading about this in the society pages, photographers following us to the park, his daycare teachers looking at us differently." Julian reached for her hands, but she pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "Maybe," she started, then stopped. "Maybe what?" "Maybe this is the universe telling us we're trying to build something that was never meant to exist. Maybe the differences between us are too big to overcome." "Don't say that!" Julian's voice was sharp with panic. "This is exactly what they want, to scare you away, to make you doubt what we have. What if they're right, though? What if I am just the help who got lucky? What if loving me really will damage your reputation, your business, Elijah's future?" "Stop." Julian moved around the table, pulling her into his arms despite her resistance. "Listen to me. Victoria's parents are grieving, angry people who want someone to blame for their daughter's death. I understand their pain, but I won't let them destroy our family because of it." "Our family," Savannah repeated bitterly. "According to these papers, we're not a family. We're a man having a midlife crisis and the woman who's taking advantage of his grief. You know that's not true." "Do I?" Savannah's voice cracked. "Sometimes I look around this house, at the life you've given us, and I wonder if I'm just playing dress-up in someone else's story, Victoria's story." The mention of his late wife hung between them like a blade. Julian's hands dropped to his sides, his face stricken. "Is that what you really think? That you're some kind of replacement? I think I'm a woman who fell in love with a man so far out of her league that people hire lawyers to point out how inappropriate it is." Tears spilled down Savannah's cheeks. "I think I'm a mother who's terrified that fighting this battle will traumatize her son, but equally terrified that not fighting it will teach him to run from love when it gets complicated." Upstairs, they could hear Elijah's voice as he talked to his toy cars, creating elaborate stories of adventure and heroism. The innocent sound made Savannah's heart break even more. "What are you saying?" Julian asked quietly. "I'm saying maybe I should take Elijah and disappear for a while. Let you handle this legal mess without us being targets." "Absolutely not." Julian's voice was steel. "I won't lose you again, and I won't let our son think that love means running when things get difficult." "Then what do you suggest? Because I can't—" Savannah's voice broke completely. "I can't watch them tear apart everything we've built. I can't have photographers following Elijah to school, can't have his classmates' parents whispering about his mother being a gold digger and his father being unstable." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but determined. "We fight, not in court, not with lawyers and depositions. We fight the only way that matters, by proving them wrong." "How?" "By showing the world exactly what kind of family we are. By refusing to hide or be ashamed of what we've built together." Julian cupped her face in his hands. "Savannah, I love you. Not because you're convenient or available or because you remind me of Victoria. I love you because you're brave and beautiful and you make our son laugh every day. I love you because you see the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." "Julian, marry me." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Savannah's breath caught. "What? Marry me? Not because of the legal case, not to spite Victoria's parents, but because I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, because I want Elijah to grow up seeing what it looks like when two people choose each other every day, because I'm tired of being afraid of happiness." "This is crazy. You're proposing in the middle of a crisis." "I'm proposing because of the crisis, because it made me realize that I don't want to waste another day not being your husband." Julian's voice was rough with emotion. "I should have asked you months ago. I should have made it clear to the world that you're not my mistress or my rebound, or any of the things they're calling you. You're the woman I want to build a life with." Savannah stared at him, torn between hope and terror. "And if we get married, and they still try to take Elijah, if they argue that we're just doing it for appearances, then we'll have faced it together, as a family, as husband and wife." Julian's thumbs brushed away her tears. "I can't promise this will be easy. I can't promise there won't be more battles, more people who don't understand or approve of what we have, but I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together." "Daddy, Mama," Elijah's voice drifted down from upstairs. "Are you having a sad talk?" "Because I heard crying." "We'll be right up, baby," Savannah called back, her voice thick with tears. "Is that a yes?" Julian asked softly. Savannah looked into his eyes and saw her future, messy and complicated, and absolutely worth fighting for. "Ask me properly." Julian smiled for the first time since the lawyers had arrived, that devastating smile that had captured her heart 3 years ago. He dropped to one knee right there in their kitchen, taking her hands in his. "Savannah James, will you marry me? Will you let me love you and Elijah for the rest of my life? Will you help me build something beautiful and strong enough to weather any storm?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Julian, yes, to all of it." When he kissed her, it tasted like tears and promises and the kind of love that was worth fighting for. Upstairs, Elijah called down again, and they broke apart laughing. "Should we tell him?" Julian asked. "Together," Savannah said, taking his hand. "We tell him together." They found Elijah in his room, building what looked like a fortress out of his blocks. When he saw their faces, Tear-stained but glowing, he smiled. "Did you fix the sad?" he asked. "We're working on it," Julian said, settling on the floor beside their son. But we have some happy news to share." "I like happy news. Daddy asked Mama to marry him," Savannah said, sitting cross-legged next to Elijah. "Would you like that, if we got married and became a family officially?" Elijah considered this with his usual seriousness. "Will you still be my Mama and Daddy?" "Always," they said in unison. "And will we still live in this house with the good climbing tree?" "If you want to," Julian confirmed. "Then yes," Elijah declared, "but I get to help plan the wedding, and there have to be lots of flowers, and maybe some of those little cakes that Mrs. Rodriguez makes." "Deal," Savannah laughed, pulling both her boys into a hug. Later that night, after Elijah had fallen asleep surrounded by wedding plans he'd drawn in crayon, Julian and Savannah sat in their garden, surrounded by the lavender and roses she'd planted. The legal papers still sat on the kitchen table, still threatened their peace, but somehow the burden felt lighter when shared. "Are you scared?" Savannah asked, her head on Julian's shoulder. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of them. I'm scared of how much I love you, how much I have to lose if I mess this up." "You won't mess this up. We won't let each other." Julian pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of lavender that always clung to her hair. "No, we won't. Because we're building something stronger than fear, stronger than other people's opinions. We're building forever." In the distance, thunder rumbled, another storm approaching, but this time they would weather it together. The wedding took place 6 months later in their own backyard, surrounded by the flowers Savannah had coaxed into bloom and the people who truly mattered. It was nothing like the elaborate society affairs Julian had once attended, and it was perfect precisely because of that simplicity. Savannah wore a dress she'd found in a vintage shop in the village, cream silk with delicate beadwork that caught the afternoon light. Her hair was crowned with a wreath of lavender and baby's breath that Elijah had helped create, his small fingers surprisingly deft at weaving stems together. "You look like a princess, Mama," he whispered as he walked her down the makeshift aisle that wound through their garden. "The kind that saves herself but likes it when people help." Julian waited for them beneath an arbor heavy with climbing roses, and when their eyes met, Savannah felt the same electric connection that had first sparked during that storm 3 years ago. He looked devastatingly handsome in his charcoal suit, but it was the expression on his face, wonder, gratitude, and overwhelming love, that took her breath away. The legal battle with Victoria's parents had ended 2 months earlier, dismissed by a judge who had seen through their grief-motivated manipulation. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the way their family had grown stronger through the ordeal, their love deepening under pressure like carbon becoming diamond. "Dearly beloved," began the officiant, a warm woman who had counseled them through the complexities of blending a family. "And we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Julian and Savannah, but also to celebrate the family they have already become." The ceremony was full of personal touches that made it uniquely theirs. Elijah served as ring-bearer, carrying the bands in a small wooden box he'd built himself. When the time came for vows, Julian spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his grey eyes. "Savannah, you taught me that love doesn't have to be perfect to be permanent. You showed me that the strongest foundations are built not on what we have, but on who we choose to become together. You gave me our son, who reminds me every day that wonder and joy are choices we can make. I promise to choose you, choose us, choose this beautiful, complicated, extraordinary life we're building together." Savannah's vows were written on paper that trembled in her hands, but her voice was strong. "Julian, you could have given me houses and diamonds and all the security money can buy. Instead, you gave me something more precious. You gave me partnership. You became the father our son deserved, the man I always believed you could be. You proved that love isn't about control or protection, but about showing up day after day and choosing to grow together. I promise to tend our love like the garden we're standing in, with patience, with attention, with faith that beautiful things can bloom even after the hardest winters. When they kissed, sealing their commitment, the small gathering of friends erupted in cheers. But Savannah barely heard them. All she could focus on was the feel of Julian's lips against hers, the solid warmth of his hands framing her face, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. The reception was as unconventional as the ceremony. Long tables set up in the garden, mismatched chairs borrowed from neighbors, string lights wound through the apple tree where Elijah loved to climb. The cake was a 3-tier creation made by Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street, decorated with sugar flowers that looked remarkably like the ones growing around them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Julian took Savannah's hand and led her to the small clearing where he'd had a surprise installed, a piano, weatherproofed and perfect for outdoor concerts. "You bought me a piano," Savannah laughed, running her fingers over the keys. "I bought us a piano," Julian corrected. "Well, I thought it was time I shared my music with the world instead of hiding it in the dark." He sat down on the bench and patted the space beside him. As Savannah settled next to him, Julian began to play, not the melancholy pieces he'd once used to express his grief, but something light and joyful, something that spoke of hope and new beginnings. Soon, their guests had gathered around them, some singing along to the familiar melody, others just swaying to the music. Elijah danced with abandon on the grass, his dress-up shoes making him feel very important and grown up. "Play the song from when you first fell in love," called out Maria, Savannah's best friend, and the one who had encouraged her to take the job at the Prescott mansion all those years ago. Julian's hands found a different melody, something he'd been composing in secret, a song that captured the storm, the candlelight, the moment when two broken people had found healing in each other's arms. As he played, Savannah began to hum along, her voice weaving through the notes like she'd always known this music. "What's it called?" someone asked when the last note faded into the evening air. Julian looked at his wife, his son, their friends gathered in the garden they'd built together. "It's called Home," he said simply. Later, after the guests had gone home and Elijah had fallen asleep in his clothes, they'd decided it was too special a day to insist on pajamas. Julian and Savannah sat on their back porch, her head on his shoulder, his arms around her waist. "So, Mrs. Prescott," Julian said, the title sending warmth through her chest. "Any regrets?" "Just one," Savannah said seriously. Julian tensed. "What's that?" "I regret waiting so long to believe we deserved this." She tilted her head to look at him. All those months of being afraid, of thinking love had to be perfect to be permanent. "I wish I'd understood sooner that the best things are built slowly, with patience and trust, and the willingness to keep choosing each other even when it's scary." "We had to go through all of that to get here," Julian said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The fear, the separation, the legal battles, they all taught us something we needed to know, that love isn't just a feeling, it's a decision you make every day." "And what's your decision for tomorrow, Mr. Prescott?" "Same as today, same as yesterday, same as every day for the rest of my life," Julian said, his voice full of quiet certainty. "I choose you, Savannah. I choose us. I choose this beautiful, complicated, extraordinary family we've built together." Inside the house, they could hear Elijah talking in his sleep, working through some complex architectural problem in his dreams. The sound made them both smile. "Think he'll remember this day?" Savannah asked. "Maybe not the details, but he'll remember the feeling, being surrounded by people who love him, seeing his parents promise to love each other forever. He'll carry that security with him, that knowledge that love is possible and permanent and worth fighting for. And if he asks us someday how we knew we were meant to be together," Julian was quiet for a moment, considering, "I'll tell him that we didn't know, not at first. I'll tell him that love isn't about certainty, it's about courage, the courage to be vulnerable, to risk being hurt, to believe that someone else's happiness can become more important than your own fear. And I'll tell him that the best love stories aren't the ones where everything is easy, Savannah added. They're the ones where two people decide that what they're building together is worth whatever storms might come. Thunder rumbled in the distance, another storm approaching their little corner of Brooklyn. But this time, Savannah wasn't afraid. This time, she knew that love could weather anything when it was rooted deep enough, tended carefully enough, and chosen freely every single day. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Julian and Savannah went inside to their home, their marriage, their family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to choose each other. But tonight, surrounded by the scent of wedding flowers and the promise of forever, they were exactly where they belonged. In the garden where love grows, some stories never really end. They just keep blooming, season after season, more beautiful with each passing year. The end. Thanks for watching to the end. Did you like the story? Tell us what you thought in the comments below. We want to know what you think. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe now for more exciting stories you won't want to miss. Activate the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. See you in the next story. See you there.